Hello once again. I'm Greg Smart, pastor of Pikeville United Methodist Church in Pikeville, Tennessee. And as always, I'm here with some thoughts on Scripture. And today's passage is, it's very appropriate for the summer vacation season. Although in truth, it's appropriate for any season, especially whatever season finds you the busiest. So listen today for Jesus' attitude toward work and rest. This is our gospel lesson, Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 34. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. Jesus said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now, many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Well, maybe we should begin by just acknowledging Jesus would have been a great boss. Now, yes, he expected hard work out of his disciples, his staff, if you will. But he was also continually teaching them so that they would be better workers, so that they would feel better about the job that they were doing. When they made mistakes, Jesus did not fire anyone or dock their pay. He simply turned it into a teachable moment. But on top of all that, Jesus was definitely not going to work his people to death, because Jesus understood the importance of rest. And in that way, Jesus was pretty much the opposite of the boss you may have read about recently on BuzzFeed. Now, this boss in question had already given one of his workers, a young woman, a day off. Let's say it was on a Thursday. He'd given her that Thursday off so that this young woman could attend her grandmother's funeral. But on the Thursday in question, the boss calls up this young woman first thing in the morning and asks her to come in to cover someone else's shift. Well, when the young woman reminded the boss of that day's funeral, the boss did not say, "Oh gosh, I'm so sorry, I totally forgot. Forget I even called." He didn't say anything like that. What he said to her was, "Your grandmother would want you to work." Well, thankfully, Jesus has a lot more sympathy than that boss did. And when it came to a day off or to rest, Jesus not only approved of it, he insisted on it. That's what we see in verse 31 of that passage. These disciples are coming off a particularly difficult and draining period of work. And Jesus says to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." Now, that word rest in no way signals that the work is over or that this is a permanent vacation. Rather, that Greek word that we have translated here as rest means something more like an intermission. It's a respite, a time to refresh, to renew one's strength before jumping right back into work. Now, there are times when a longer period of rest is needed, but in general, this word we have here, this intermission, it is less a vacation than it is a really good coffee break or a siesta. Well, these periods of rest, these intermissions, the first thing we really need to understand about them is that they are not selfish. However long they may be, they're not selfish. What they are is self-care. Now that's a really important distinction. You see, something selfish is something that is done only for you. And while you're doing it, you don't really care what's happening to other people or what they might think of it. Self-care, meanwhile, is doing self-maintenance, the kind of maintenance that makes sure you can continue to care for others. And if you were to neglect that maintenance, well, you just might find yourself broken down on the side of the road, no good to anyone. Hal Brady pastored a 5,000-member church. But one day, while he was walking down the hall, it became apparent that there was something wrong with Brady's back. When he was asked about it, he admitted that, his back needed a pretty simple procedure, but it was one that would require 2 weeks of recovery. And he then admitted that he didn't want to be out for that long. He didn't want to be away from his post for that long. So he was putting off this surgery. And he continued putting it off, thinking that there would be a natural break in the church's events. Well, newsflash, there really is no such break when you have a large church like that. So while Brady kept putting off this procedure, his back kept deteriorating until it finally just went out on him. And Hal Brady was forced into a much more serious operation. And the result of which, he wasn't out for just the 2 weeks. He was out for 2 months. So no, self-care is not selfish. I mean, if it was, Jesus would not have taken such regular periods of rest for himself, nor would he have taught his disciples to do the same. And it turns out that self-care is actually a big part of how we live Jesus' great commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. When we love ourselves by practicing self-care, by taking these periods, these intermissions of rest, we're in much better shape to love the neighbors that are all around us. Now, that's really the main point behind taking those periods of rest. But there is another reason for it, and it's the one we find unfolding in today's passage. And this is that when we practice that self-care, when we take those periods of rest when they are available and when they're necessary, then we are better able for whatever may come our way. This is what we see in verses 33 and 34. We find that after that period of rest, these disciples encounter a very large crowd. That crowd has been waiting for Jesus. And if you continue reading in that passage, you'll find Jesus and those disciples feeding that crowd, a crowd of 5,000. Well, it was that period of rest, that renewal of strength that really enabled them to pull off this massive task. The best piece of professional advice I ever received came in the first 2 weeks of my time as a pastor. Now, I had no more gotten the keys and unpacked my books when Reese Fawcett, a veteran pastor serving in that same county, called me up. And he took the time to drive me around and show me places I would need to know, and he introduced me to some folks who proved to be very helpful. And while we were driving, Reese said, if you ever get a day with nothing on your schedule, or if you have an afternoon unexpectedly open up because an appointment got canceled, take off. Go fishing. Go do whatever it is you like to do. Because almost without exception, there is a whole bunch of stuff coming down the pike right at you. Well, Reese was right, of course. We never know when the next busy spell will arrive or when a series of disasters will demand our attention. But by taking those periods of rest when we can, by doing the necessary self-care, we are much better able to handle whatever comes down that road. And this is what Jesus taught his disciples. I'll be back next week with some more thoughts on Scripture. Until then, have a good week, and if you have any thoughts on this, I'd love to hear from you.